So now I'd like to introduce to our speaker for tonight. Okay, Craig is a qualitative and historic researcher. He has been involved in tertiary education and management since 1993 and has lectured and supervised research students at university and polytechnics in several Asia-Pacific countries. He is a multidisciplinary in outlook, where his undergraduate degrees in socioeconomic geography, masters in economic development, and doctoral work in economics and globalization. He holds additional postgraduate qualification in tertiary teaching and learning, and he has a keen interest in educational management and facilitation development. So Craig's career started in learning support, which is why he chose to be first and foremost a teacher and a mentor, and only then a researcher. He is now the principal and co-founder of the Third Degree, an academic resource platform for postgraduate students, and now devoted to providing solutions to help empower research students. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Craig.
Great, thank you very much. So good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Special thanks to ACT4Health for inviting me to contribute tonight and to some of the other sessions that are coming up. Tonight's topic I've aptly termed Shift Happens, effectively pivoting your research from offline to online. And the reason I entitled it this is because this is something that we have had very limited control over, as the pandemic has caused us to rethink, reactivate, realign. It really is a shift for us as researchers, for us as research students. And I wanted to talk about some of the issues that go through what we have to think about as we make this shift. First up, I'm just going to share a few objectives for tonight. We want to be able to understand how we can pivot our research plans during and post-pandemic. I want to highlight, we are looking both now and into the future, because this is not just a knee-jerk reaction. This is also potentially going to set up for us what we are going to do for the coming few years in terms of our approach to methodology. I also want to develop some awareness of the issues that impact such a pivot. Most of us can say, oh yeah, let's just take everything online, let's interview, or let's do focus groups, or let's do surveys online. But have we considered all the minute details that impact the credibility of our research? And that's what I'm going to spend probably over half of my discussion tonight talking about. And then finally, we're going to investigate solutions for these impacts so that our research can continue smoothly. Ultimately, we want to finish our research. We want to graduate with whatever postgraduate qualification we're doing or postdoc experience that we are doing. So we need to make sure that it is a long-term strategy in relation to our particular objectives as well. Before we move on, I would like to invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn, either my personal page, which is the first link, or my company page for the Third Degree, which is the second link. Now, a little bit about my approach. I'm kind of very old school, so I talk a lot. I invite questions at the end, but any questions you have, please put in the chat room as you go through. If there's an urgent question and you're like, Craig, address it now, just raise your hand and we'll take care of that as well. But do understand that I am here as a resource. The things that I want to talk about tonight are quite extensive. There's a lot to be able to be achieved within this small amount of time. But also, I'm not able to cover everything that's relevant. So if there's something that I have been unable to cover or haven't touched upon, please feel free to ask me during the process or at the end, and I can address to the best of my abilities as we go through. So I want to start off with the context for this. The restrictions of movement and the emerging and ever-changing standard operating procedures, along with other fundamental changes in society as a result of the global pandemic, actually are impacting qualitative researchers and those who would traditionally conduct what I'm just going to loosely call personal research. This can either be considered as a roadblock or a speed bump. Now, that's actually your choice. It either is going to shut down our research completely, i.e., we leave, or it proffers up an opportunity for us to pivot in a way that will enable continuity of research, maintaining robust credibility in the data obtained, and the opportunity, to continue relatively smoothly with our research journey, with least interruption possible given the parameters. And I do highlight least interruption here because it's not going to be the same. What we are doing is finding the best way to move forward given the context. To me, the speed bump is not seamless. It is the sensible option, and one that we as research students, or you as research students and emerging researchers, should be looking to embrace. As I said, tonight's discussion is not going to be comprehensive. The issues are vast, but it should serve as an introduction to the key points that we should consider in terms of getting our research on track in the new normal. And, tonight I'm going to talk about 3.5 different things. The three key things are coming through with what's really important in terms of issues, how we are going to look at interviews, and how we are going to look at focus groups. The 0.5 at the end are two reference lists. Let me just retrack to 3.5 things. I'm going to share the 0.5 is actually two very extensive reading lists that I would like to share with you. These will give you guidance into different areas, some of which I'm talking about this evening, some of which will be completely different to what I talk about in terms of far beyond, I guess. But these are two references that I'm going to make sure that are emailed to everybody who participates tonight, and use those to take the discussion and the narrative for you a little bit further. We are all going to be in very different situations, and because of that, we need to be able to see what's going to work for us at each time. As I move into the next slide, which is Issues in a Digital Research Pivot, I come back to the title, which is Shift Happens. We need to take our research online as a fundamental change in our execution of research today. For many, we're going to consider it something that's a parallel consideration, a logical approach. And yeah, in reality, it is. But as with any research design change, there is going to be a butterfly or a multiplier effect, issues which arise because of a fundamental shift in an element of the research. And these little impacts are going to have further on impacts. This should not be a limitation for us, but rather it should be for us as a researcher, an invitation to think strategically and to ask ourselves, how can I adjust my approach and everything that surrounds it to still create quality research, which is the ultimate goal of what we are trying to do. So in pivoting, we need to consider a few different things. First of all, site and participant selection. Secondly, data collection methods. And thirdly, data analysis strategies and techniques. All three of these are part of the fundamental shift from offline to online. So let me go into a little bit of brevity on each. For site and participant selection, researchers have a new range of concerns about what we are doing for research. This includes identifying participants. Now that people are no longer congregating together in the same spaces. For example, I know many of you are here from health sciences and medical. My medical and doctor friends have told me that throughout the last 12 months, they've had a drop of 75% in terms of the number of patients that are coming through. For us as researchers, that may limit our ability to get exposure to target groups of people that we wish to interact with. So we were going to have issues of access. We're going to have issues about asking people for time now. You know, pre-pandemic, pre-lockdown, movement restrictions, it was very easy, or it was easier to get people's time. But today, lives have been turned upside down. And what was once the privacy of an office or a home situation may now be a combination of work from home with no privacy from one's surroundings. So that means people might be less willing or more reluctant to be able to participate in research that we're doing simply because of the other people who are now around them every single day. Our emerging task too is, how do we humanize our research online? A design pivot may open up our access to groups, or it may limit it. It's very difficult. In terms of the second one, data collection methods, the fundamental question is, do we postpone data collection or do we shift it? Let's consider going online, which we are tonight. However, let's give an example. Research on domestic violence may now facilitate us conducting online discussions with a victim whilst their partner or their aggressor, I might be being too assumptive here, but could be monitoring them, given a work from home situation. Again, it comes down to the reconfiguration of our participants' lives and how we can slot into that in a way that they are comfortable with. Maybe we need an alternative. Maybe we have to consider audio diaries, collaborative Google documents, WhatsApp groups, so many alternatives that we've got, but are they going to give us the type of rich data that we're hoping for? Broadly speaking, we need to expand our options, then to determine both their usefulness and their effectiveness in the context of the research that we are doing and the anticipated outcomes we desire for. In terms of number 3, data analysis strategies and techniques, how do these parallel to pre-pandemic methods? So this can range from coding to tonality analysis, to viewing and understanding body language. All of these are considerations that should at least fleetingly pass through our mind as we make the conscious decision to adjust or to realign our strategies. I'm now going to spend quite a bit of time talking about 5 areas to consider. And these 5 areas are areas that you need to either reconceptualize, whether it be a little bit or a lot, because for some there will, it will be a significant change. But these are things that will ensure your research approach remains robust, credible, and that when you come to defend your research, which is more importantly, and are asked about the parameters of your method pivot, you can defend these with confidence. It's very easy to change, but remember that our defense of this pivot is equally as important as the original methodological approaches that we had on board. So don't leave it out of your consideration, don't leave it out of your methodology discussion, and ultimately don't leave some mention out of your research output or outputs. So the 5 areas are pretty easy: practical, planning, ethical, technological, and personal. Again, I've categorized these conveniently to really cover important issues, but I might have left a few out. So keep me in check with that. At least make sure you are comfortable with the discussion on these 5 first, and then you can appreciate that additional thinking and consideration is going to be needed as well. So let's start with number 1, practical. So this is obviously, a very simple terminology here, but let's go through a few of the key issues. Think about what your digital workflow is going to be and how that and its logistics are going to change with an online pivot. Converting everything to an online format, be it focus groups, interviews, um, surveys, observation, which there is an extent we can do it, and even historical documentary research. Uh, any of these changes is going to change our digital workflow as well. We will spend more time at the computer. We will have to become more comfortable with the environment in which we're in. We are going to lose aspects of that personal connection that we have with our respondents and with those who participate in our research and those that we connect with on a day-to-day basis. What we need to consider here is how is this change going to change how you go about doing your research? COVID pushed us more deeply as well to consider the why and the how that we are doing qualitative research. It's not only the tools that we are looking at specifically, but the research itself within the digital spaces. Tools are perhaps an older, outdated word these days, and we should be looking more at digital spaces in terms of the online communities and forums, the sources of data, the spaces that we create as researchers, and the spaces that we engage with. Now, for data, we need to distinguish between what is researcher generated and what is naturally occurring. The distinction is broadened with the concept of spaces. In fact, a lot of data will be there whether the researcher is involved or not. But coming back, we as researchers create digital spaces for our participants and for our respondents. We've got to make sure that the spaces that we create are both safe and productive for ourselves as researchers, but for our respondents as well. Even if we look at historical researchers, which is where I put my hand up here, a lot of archives have now been digitized and have gone online and have enhanced accessibility to enable new opportunities. So for someone like myself, I've actually seen a huge increase in opportunity to access resources within a digital research space. And then what I do and how I choose to use those with other respondents can change as well. We also have to consider from the practical perspective, community engagement and community entry. And the challenge here is of linking to our community gatekeepers in the conventional ways. Community as effectively as any group in this context relevant to the researcher and the research. Can we still connect via the same gatekeepers, given that everybody's pattern of involvement in their daily life has changed? And are the traditional gatekeepers that we use to get access to a sample population still relevant for us today? And ultimately, what changes in approach do we now have to consider to actually make our new approach relevant so that we're still getting access to the individuals or the groups that we want to be involved with? I'm going to move into the concept of planning. Okay. We want to be able to talk about, first up, whether we want to postpone research or its viability. I think we have invested so much into the research that we try to achieve that we lose if we say it's time to postpone. Even if the world was to go into a third or fourth, or I can't count now, but in terms of lockdown, even if that was to happen, it's not to our advantage. Plus, as things move on, if we are not maintaining currency with our research, there is a very strong possibility that someone else will do it, or that it will lose relevance because other researchers have leapfrogged well over where we are. So the viability has to be in finding a way to make it happen. And that's where we consider our ways to conduct research remotely. The online approaches during social distancing. Do we remove, for example, an observational element, or can we restructure an observational element and think about it a different way? Do we need to think about reframing our research? So in this case, what I encourage is re-examine the research framework that you've got, seeking a justification for a pivot online, and ensure that your approach is methodologically sound. The reference list that you will be emailed later will give you some really interesting sources to be able to consider this. From a planning perspective, we have to ask, how do we go about onboarding new participants? Okay, so they may know the status from the start. It could be new to them, no change that impacts them, or other than ensuring perhaps some ethical guidelines are accommodated for. But what about participants that are already partway through the research process with you? Will they continue? Will this change in methodology take them outside their comfort zone and ultimately result in them perhaps withdrawing informed consent and consent to participate in this context? Um, Participants from which you already have data, that's fine. Can their contribution be robustly compared to new participants or those in the transition? The changes in channel may be enough to make some elements of comparison challenging. Simply body language and its observability may limit the value of online data. The problem when we pivot part way through the execution of a research plan is there will always be elements of data collection that no longer are 100% the same, i.e., what we did a year ago and the people that we were able to interview and work with a year ago and the data we collected is not going to be seamlessly comparable to those that we might have interacted with 6 months ago, simply because the fundamental base of offline and online has changed. So develop a plan that refocuses not only on approach, but also look at whether the questions are relevant too. So think about the specific challenges and opportunities that the context of the pandemic has caused for you. I'm going to talk about adapting methods, and this is actually a very good research from Janet Salmon called the E-Research Framework, and it's worth looking at and perhaps listening to a few of her online podcasts and short video segments as well. In terms of, say, initial interviews, it's not only the fact that the researcher or the research and the researcher is going through different processes. The participants are too. And we have to accommodate for the fact that their lives are now different because of what is happening. And that has to be reflected in our understanding of what we're asking from them and in our approach to making sure that the data we obtain through our various methods is still going to be relevant. There's a few points that Janet made that I thought were really quite good. As researchers, how do we participate and relate to others online? And this is something interesting. Are we reading? Are we interactive, either casual or in depth? What role do we play in leading the discussions that we have with our participants? The challenge between offline and online is not that you're not getting the opportunity to have narratives and you're not getting the opportunity to get discussions, because that is there. What you're not getting is that opportunity for that uh, very personalized human contact that you get being one on one with an individual in the same room. And when you take it to online, you lose a lot of observability. You have other issues that come into it, but that also will impact the level of trust and comfort that the respondents we engage with have of us and our observability of them. So let's take a quick look at our role as the researcher online. We can relate to privacy and data collection. Our job is to get people to open up, to tell us something. Usually, it's going to be something that's sensitive or something that is private, about their lives or about their experiences. So, how do we engage as a researcher? And I'd like to present you with three metaphors for this: the miner, the traveler, and the gardener. The miner is somebody, a researcher who digs for information, constantly trying to elicit that next little nugget of gold from the respondent because they need it to fulfill their predetermined ideas of what's going to happen. The second one, the traveler, is journeying with the participant. So almost, I'm going to put it in a terrible way, but almost holding their hand and hugging them along the process. But the traveler as a researcher is somebody who steps through and lets the respondent guide the way, and you follow that guidance with the appropriate probing here and there when it's necessary. And the third one is the gardener, which I think is probably the strongest role we can play as researchers. It is about planting the seed, cultivating the relationships of trust so that people will open up to us more. Now, remember, when we are face to face with an individual, being a gardener is so much easier. But online, the technology itself is a barrier to being able to build the trust. So we need to find ways to build trust in order to encourage participants' willingness to share, because not being in the same room, we are effectively strangers. So we can use prior communications, such as emails, calls, other interactions that we may have, to build the groundwork of this trust in the upcoming conversations that we have. But face to face is really that icing on the cake. With online research, the icing has been removed. It also culminates in issues of how we present ourselves online. This is not about how we choose to dress for an interview, but it's both in situ and prior, and how the researched, the individuals that we're involved with, see us and our project as researchers and research. In situ comes back to how we enact any of the three metaphors, and what approach we take to the interaction, the narratives with each participant, and effectively our personality in the moment, but also to what they as participants can research about us online prior. And this is something I really want to emphasize at this stage. Many of us have both professional and personal online profiles, but do these convey you as a researcher and your research appropriately? Do they inspire confidence in you as a researcher and in your research as an output? Our searchability in both a personal and a professional context is important because that's going to build up respondents' understanding of who we are because they're not getting a face-to-face opportunity. But we're also going to have to consider some of us may not want everything that we put personally online to be accessible to those that we're engaging with on a professional research basis. So that's something that you might have to consider as well. A suggestion is a very simple blog that is specific to each research project that you do, that introduces you, the topics, the progress, of course, without contravening any of the confidentiality issues, but directing your participants towards that. You may also want to consider on your personal social media spaces to increase the privacy filters so that those who don't now have the opportunity to meet you face to face, but are meeting you online, don't see everything of your personal life. Um, just as a side from that, for those who are interested in how you strengthen your online presence as a researcher, doing an actual makeup class session on Monday evening, same time as this, 8 o'clock, that talks specifically about how researchers can develop their online profile. So if you're keen on that, just drop us a note in the chat box, and I'll figure out how to get you the invite afterwards. I want to move on to what I think is the most important thing, and this is one where I'm going to say you cannot not consider it, and this is ethics. A pivot to online in research may not seem to be a major transformation, but it does actually mean that ethical considerations need to be re-examined by default. The approach has changed, the parameters have changed, therefore, it may also need reapproval. So in almost every case, the research that you are undertaking has needed ethics approval from your university. Each university has a different, body or internal body that responds and looks after research students and ethical issues. So whether it's an ethics board or an internal review board or whatever, there is a strong chance that as you have pivoted, you are going to need to have them reapprove your new approaches. Now, this is why earlier I also talked about, it may be a knee-jerk reaction, but it is a long-term response to what's happening, because it's not only about how do I deal with changing SOPs today and accessibility to individuals today. You can't go and 6 months down the track say, I want to change it all back to face because we've all been vaccinated and it's perfectly okay. What we are doing is making the absolute best of what we can today and making our approach to doing this as robust as we possibly can so that our research continues. If we keep changing the approach, even though it's just a little thing like offline to online to offline again, it actually changes the risks and the exposure for our respondents, but it also changes how we're going to analyze. So look at what the changes are, understand with your supervisor, with the university ethics committee or whatever that they're called, that they are on board with those changes, but from a mindset perspective for you as a researcher, make sure that you are convinced that these changes are the final changes so that you can proceed in this. Now, there are going to be some potential new risks: identification of respondent, security and storage issues, informed consent issues, safety issues. So let's take a look at informed consent in public versus private online spaces and forums. If you post questions and use answers in a forum, for example, have you got explicit informed consent? A public forum itself does not imply fully informed consent. It exists only if you are the one who has control over that forum. If there is a gatekeeper, you are as much a participant in that forum as are others that you may in fact be extracting information from. Therefore, the opportunity for you to access informed consent is challenging. So how do we go about getting informed consent? Maybe we have to consider being observed or being observed versus being interactive. Then that challenges us with other things about the true identity of participants. In fact, identification of respondents in many cases, especially if we look at random surveys, for example, we can never guarantee honesty. What we've got to look at here, though, is if we go into a private space, that is a Zoom conversation or a focus group or even a telephone type interview where you are in control of that private space, you still need to look at how do you get reliable and acceptable informed consent. The biggest challenge I think that many of us as researchers have, but I think society as a whole too, is the internet is often seen as a fifth estate. We hide and we remake our identities to suit the purposes. And in some areas, I call this being a keyboard warrior, because you go on. Others will call it cyber troopers if you're in the Malaysian context in particular. Trolls is the more North American terminology for it. But there are a lot of people on there online that have the opportunity to somehow, by accident, intersect with our research and may end up by being our participants. So it's very easy for people to hide their real self online versus an offline situation. So this is always going to be something that we have to keep in mind. Using electronic signatures is also something that's really interesting, because can we use an electronic signature to document informed consent for us as researchers? If we look at research that involves the use of a web-based survey, for example, or an interview or a focus group, we'll also use a consent form in its traditional form. But this is going to be simple. Our signature is now a different issue. In these cases, can we consider clicking on an I agree button sufficient, and back to approval from the university, from the ethics committee? Will the university consider that to be sufficient? We have alternatives such as DocuSign, which gets us the opportunity to get a signature, but it now bridges us to some of the technological issues that we face moving online. Do our participants have the access to the necessary applications? And more importantly, do they know how to use them? Now, that's a good one for me tonight, struggling to get the screen up in the way that I would normally like. So, that's something that we've got to consider in the process of how we go about what was once a very fundamentally simple, handy person, a piece of paper, sign, file, to now having to consider, well, is a tick or is some form of thumbprint via the phone or via the laptop actually going to be a sufficient plan B for that original hand signed piece of paper giving informed consent? You've also got that whole issue of Big Brother, the internet is watching you, which is going to overshadow respondents' confidence in you as a researcher and makes them likely to self-remove from the study. Now, I'll give an example by that. I look at a number of surveys online. You find them, they pop up in your news feed and so forth. And I often go through because I want to use, or I want to find new examples of surveys that I can use during sessions that I run on survey design. But sometimes I find that it's asking so much information, not as filters, but even just to get a basic informed consent. It's asking so much information up front that it's easier for me not to be involved. And that is where you run the risk, because face to face, you have an opportunity to step people through the informed consent process and getting their signature on paper. When you're looking at a digital solution to this, many people might feel that there is something or an ulterior motive, something else associated. And they might say, you know what? This is actually, it feels a little bit too invasive. Ironically, it's exactly the same information you might ask for, but because of the method in which it is asked for, it becomes, or it might be seen to be, it might be seen to be just a little bit too difficult. So we've got to not only figure out how are we going to balance that, but how are we going to make sure that the process for our respondents is quite smooth as well. We need to also check context. So with informed consent, it depends on not only your university, but also your country. So I just want to give an example of South Africa. In South Africa, legally speaking, and this is not a ruling by universities, this is a ruling by government, all informed consent needs to be in writing. That means for us, a checkbox is completely insufficient, or in fact, useless. Now, that may not be an implication for us, but have you ever checked just to see what the national guidelines versus the university guidelines are? We also need to talk about confidentiality in terms of, the platform and the channel itself that you have chosen to facilitate your interviews or your focus groups with. Will this meet the ethics committee standards? Does your university permit these as acceptable? We will have issues about data storage, whether it be cloud versus computer, how to maintain the privacy and ensure a confidentiality with that. It also comes down to who provides the platforms. Is it the university? Is it you? What is the cost? What is the access to it? In terms of Zoom that I use quite regularly, my business partner and I share a Zoom account. Therefore, he has equal access to all recordings that I have access to as well. Yet, if I was to do some research that had especially a nature of confidentiality about them, that's not an ideal solution. The free version of Zoom does not give us the same protections that, say, the version that the university may provide to us to use. One of the bigger problems in the early days, but again, it comes down to which platform you're using. Photo bombing by outsiders is a regular feature. And I'm not just talking about the people walking behind us. I'm talking about the fact that it's actually not difficult for an external party to jump into this meeting that we're in right now and listen in. And the challenge for us, imagine if we're in a focus group and we've got 6 or 7 participants. We're so focused on the discussion and making sure that we're prompting people in the right way and that we're getting the discussion going. We may not even know if somebody who shouldn't be there has actually joined in. Now, these issues are, especially over the last year, have been resolved mostly, but it's still very easy to be able to get into some form of online correspondence. So that becomes a challenge. The next one that I think is incredibly important is participant support. Now, I look at it from this: a face-to-face focus group, for example, or an interview has immediate support or fail-safe mechanisms in place. You're there in the room with somebody. If it becomes too emotional, you're able to use your communication skills and your humanity in a way to help that individual to regain some composure, to regain a sense of security or safety within the space. And that's something that's unique to a face-to-face scenario, especially when we're talking about issues that may invoke emotion or memories that are less pleasant and so forth. In an online setting with research, we are unable to replicate this. So we have to ask the question, are we putting participants at risk in their own spaces by not being part of our space, i.e., by getting them to hop on, as we are in this meeting tonight, by getting them to hop onto an electronic device to share personal experiences with us, where there is nobody in their location to give them support should it become emotional. Are we putting them at risk? We have to talk about access to post-data collection support as well. How might this change for people in terms of accessibility or in terms of quality? The broader question, though, is constructing safe spaces. So this multiplies now because participants' safe spaces are out of our direct control. And instead of it being one space or 2 spaces, as more individuals become involved, it's multiple spaces that we have to be alert with and concerned with. And whether that is going to impact on A, their willingness to talk and to share experiences with us, or B, their emotional and even physical safety. That's something that we've got to be able to address. And our role as the researcher, even if we're going to say, look, we're going to continue with this, our role as a researcher is to find ways to make sure there is always a safety net for our respondents in these circumstances. Now we've got on to the final one, which is storage and, filing and storage. And this really, again, it's cloud versus physical computers. But this now moves into our next aspect, which is technological issues associated with a pivot to online. So, I've experienced a technological issue tonight that's annoying, but not unsurprising to be in context. But let's go through a few of the issues that we also have to consider. Our design decisions and the role of the technology that we're using. So, three different, I guess, positions for technology here. And I think two of them only really apply to us. But again, it comes down to we want to understand what role technology is going to play in the research, because that changes the way in which research is executed and data is obtained and data is analyzed. So technology is the medium, for example, Zoom or Google Meets or Microsoft Teams. With technology as the medium, we're not so concerned with the technology per se. We consider it to be a communications tool only. But as a communications tool, it may have limitations for us, or it may limit how we're able to get across and extract from those that are participating with us. We have number two, technology as a setting. So we chose technology because of its functions. I think tonight's a great example of that. We can show video, we can show visuals, we have a camera to record, we can collect, we can reflect, we can observe. The observation can be both visual, oral, text, and type data if we look at what's happening in the chat room. So there's a lot of the functionality of it gives us the opportunity to add value to the research. And the third one is technology as the phenomenon, which is how does the technology work and how are the people or the respondents using and embracing it. But this is more towards an internet studies kind of thing and less relevant to, I think, those of us who are here tonight. But all issues to acknowledge, we need to think about the role of the researcher in what is being researched. Technology is a new layer to think about in respect of that concept of role as well. We want to look at defining technology and its role. Our starting point is with theorizing the nature of digital tools. So how deterministic of an orientation does the technology have? Now, this probably goes a little bit more philosophical than we want to think about. But at the end of the day, do the tools determine what happens with our research? Can they limit or open up the data that we obtain? So there are going to be considerations of this nature that we need to take into account. How much will the technology that we use to turn or to convert our research online take away from the original experience and the original opportunity to interact and collect data that we had? Remember, another point that's really interesting is tools are not, and I made a spelling mistake, I'm so sorry. Tools are not neutral, Neutral. I do apologize for that. Tools are not neutral. They're either of they're commercial in nature, proprietary technology, vis-a-vis open source technology, which present a lot more challenges. There's the issue of affordability of technology and tools and the trade-offs involved in curating quality research. So although we're here talking about qualitative research, I'm just going to give a very simple quantitative example. We can use a number of very good quality quantitative analysis packages, SPSS, for example. Now, I'm not sure about the price of SPSS, but I do know that it can be in the hundreds, if not the early thousands, to be able to get a license if one is buying privately, versus a software package called R, which is open source and as old as my career, because I was there when it started, because it comes from the university I first graduated from. R has become open source and available for everybody, but it evolves, it changes in a different way. There isn't the technical support compared to SPSS, it's more crowdsourced. So all of these things are going to change how we can make use of it. But it ultimately comes down to accessibility and cost. And by not purchasing the latest or the most popular commercially available package out there? Are we devaluing our research because we've gone to use an open source, crowdsourced fund approach to software? Or by using a particular software versus another one, do we cause challenges for our research? Now, they may be, you may think it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but at the end of the day, we're looking at quality, credible, robust outcomes. And if somebody is going to come down and say, you know what, it's actually very difficult given the software that you've chosen to use, the analysis isn't quite to the level we would have hoped, or actually, SPSS would have done it differently, or in vivo would have done it differently. That impacts upon the perceived quality of our research as well. The last issue under technological is recording issues. So what technology do we use to record? We have tape versus digital. We have storage aside, the quality of the recording over a Wi-Fi network may also be different. Accidents happen. I lost a webinar that I did that I was purposely recording so I could put it online as well as do it live because I accidentally pushed the wrong button. In the heat of the moment, despite having people there to help me, these little incidents happen as they might during a face-to-face example, but we're probably more experienced on face-to-face. Are we recording on one versus many devices? Zoom is one device, for example. How do we extend that so that we have a backup on something else as well? So these are the technological sides. I want to move into the personal side, which is the last part, and then I'll just go on and I'm going to briefly talk about both interviews and focus groups, but I think I'll talk about those quite fast, and then we can open up to a Q&A session. So I don't want to come across, when I talk about Section 5 personal, I don't want to come across as patronizing, so please don't take it in that respect. After all, at PhD level, we're meant to be pretty intelligent people. But the honest truth, and again, I experienced this tonight, it doesn't mean that we've got it all together. I'm not perfect with technology, and the moment one thing goes wrong, it kind of filters through on others. It doesn't also mean that we've got it all together. We've been impacted by the pandemic. We have the limitations in technology. We also have phobias. And I want to give you a really interesting story, and this is a true personal story. So in addition to what I do with the third degree, I also own a communications company. I do public relations, I do branding, I do marketing strategy. And I have a little phobia. And my phobia is I do not talk on the telephone. I am absolutely scared of having a conversation on the telephone with people. I can go up to you in a meeting space or in public. I can have a wonderful face-to-face conversation with you. But if you phone me on the phone, my heart rate elevates. I turn the phone off. I hide the phone. I might sit on the phone if it repeats its ringing, simply because I have a phobia there. Now, this in itself means it's not really so much the story about me, but it is the story about how comfortable we are to shift our mindsets to try and do something else. A great thing about Zoom is I am very happy to jump onto a Zoom or a Skype or whatever platform and do a video-based call. It's essentially a phone call, but because I see you, or theoretically I see you, I have control over that situation. Now that's been a boon for me because I've always done training face-to-face. So online I've got to do it in a way that I'm comfortable. But if I'm doing, for any reason, I have to do it via the phone, that's a problem. Now, it comes back to uh, our level of comfort and ultimately our respondents' level of comfort in what's happening. What are the triggers today that are different from previous? You know, the challenges we can face are lack of technical skills. I certainly have that with the platform tonight, and I apologize. Access to the software and or platforms. You are going to have respondents who may not have the technology or the access to the technology. I have a colleague that I invite to present on a number of the webinars that I do. And he's an older gentleman, highly intelligent. He's been a professor for many years. He does not have WhatsApp. He only has Skype and a phone that calls. He does not even know how to text. So we all have different limitations when it comes to this. There is emotional discomfort. And I'll give you another example. I can only ever do a Zoom in an empty room. I will not do a call if a session like this or an interactive session, even a meeting like this, if there is somebody else in the immediate vicinity to me. So this is an emotional discomfort that can impact. And again, go back to the very first thing I said about workflow. Okay, financial constraints come into play, the cost of the software, the cost of platform access, even the cost of getting a stable Wi-Fi connection, or the need to rent a private space where you can actually conduct your research from, because working from home may not be the ideal situation for a researcher. So to me, these are all personal and professional growth points for us as researchers, for us as students, and for us as supervisors alike, all worth considering. Now, I know I'm probably going a little bit over time, so I'm going to ask you to bear with me for a couple of minutes. I'm going to quickly talk about pivoting the personal interview. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to direct you to perhaps some of the resources, I think, and let us move into the question and answer time, because I know I've gone over. But just let me see what is worth really specifically talking about. I think, you know, if I move into here, doing the interview, I'm just going to highlight the last point about getting consent. And again, it comes down to what we talked about before. Amongst the 5 key things that have to go through our mind, and potentially what we write or how we write about this, is how we're going to get informed consent from for doing an interview. Now, you're not missing out on anything specific here. In the reference list that is going to be emailed to you in the next few days, I'll actually send you my notes that relate to this. I was really going to talk about just a few of the things that are different, but I think I would much rather focus at this moment on pivoting the focus group. Now, in actual fact, I just see, is it there? That's not there. Okay. Pivoting the focus group. The reference that is here under the heading is a fantastic resource that I highly recommend that you take a read of. It is where I've taken the structure for my comments for this section tonight. So if I'm sort of rushing through it a little bit more, just, you know, you can go and read in more depth about some of the issues that are here. But let me go through a few of these key similarities and differences with a traditional focus group and an online focus group. But remember that you can always head back to that particular reference, and it will be emailed to you. And then you'll be able to take a look in a little bit more detail, and you're always welcome to email me, further down the track with questions as well. For my part with this, I just want to highlight a few elements of similarities and differences. Now, we've got screeners in recruitment. So, recruiting online groups to become part of a focus groups requires especially crafted screeners that are going to be similar in content and depth to what we're going to use for in-person focus groups. As always, the quality of the screener can determine the quality of a respondent. Now, a screener is a set of questions that is designed to make sure you're getting the type of people that you want in the focus group, rather than a random choice of 6 people off the street and you hope that they even have the faintest idea what you're talking about. Now that many of the screeners are administered electronically, we have to look at the question wording being a little bit different so as to disguise qualifying and disqualifying answers. When we interact with people in a more face-to-face environment, we tend to be more vocal or verbal in our asking of screeners, which means we get an instant reaction from them. So, do you eat bread on a daily basis? Yes or no? It's not something you have to think about. When we look at electronic digital screeners, questions that are on the screen in front of us, we actually have time to think about the question. Now, this is going to sound nasty, but there are a lot of people out there who are going to invest their time, because they have it, to participate in some of our research, simply because they want socialization. They want a sense of community, whatever. With screeners being electronically or digitally controlled, because they have the chance to read and to think, they have that extra time to think about what is the answer that they think we really want. So a screener electronically may not be as, what's the word for it? I hate when I forget a word. The reaction, or their reaction electronically, is going to be more considered than their reaction if we were looking other methods to get hold of them. Okay, so that's important. We can go a little bit deeper into screeners, and one of the things that I've got, let me just read something I wrote in my notes. A well-written screener in combination with professional online facility will thank and release all disqualified respondents without them knowing why. More importantly, this, as well as putting a block on their electronic address, discourages them from retrying to qualify. Now, we may not even have the technical skills to be able to make that happen, but we are going to have to use our questions and perhaps layer these questions to make sure that the people who we are involving are more closely aligned with the topic of our research, not our views per se, but at least the topic of our research, rather than people who are just looking for a client experience. Not client experience, looking for a socialization experience. That moves me into the view for client observers. Now, in some cases, there may be a third party involved in observing the research that we undertake, especially if we have been funded for our research by a third party. Technology actually makes it possible for them to view, which may not happen in a normal face-to-face setting. But it also enables us to communicate in different ways with the individuals. We're in a meeting now where in a few minutes we're all going to be able to talk to each other. But at the same time, you've been able to send through chat room messages. You've been able to access other formats of information, which gives you a plethora of channels to communicate through, which we don't necessarily have in face to face. I just want to move on to perhaps discussion guide development and design. This really does resemble what we do for in-person groups, but because of the nature of communication online and the fact that it isn't as smooth as people say it is, a focus group may end up by taking a little bit longer than normally. The number of questions that we can expect to get through may reduce a little bit as well. So that's something to be able to think about. And I think the last point I'm going to touch on before I go to Q&A is moderating. Moderating a group of people in the same space is not the same as moderating a group of people online. And you've got to not only adjust your mindset and your approach to this, but you've got to be able to make sure that your assistant, if you're bringing other people in to help you, or if you're running multiple groups and you're using several moderators to assist you, you've got to make sure that they're all trained not only in the skill of moderation, but in understanding the nuances of the platforms that you're working with so that they can get things from. It's very challenging, in a face-to-face focus group scenario. We have a lot of ability to reflect on all aspects of body language. When we look at what we see today, you have a headshot, maybe an upper body. There's very little that you get out of body language. So you've got to be able to work out how else can I get those subtler cues from participants as we've got. Now I'm just going to move to the last thing. These are the two resource lists that will be emailed to you. They're both quite extensive, but they will give you a lot more detail than what I've been able to talk about this evening. I'm actually surprised it took so long to get through the first section, but I think there's a lot of relevant information in there that we have to be making sure is in our minds. These two resource lists go deeper into different aspects of research pivoting online and different techniques and skills that you can develop, and perhaps answering more detailed questions that you have. So I'm going to hand it over for a Q&A discussion now, and I hope Nina will be leading that. For anybody who's interested in contacting me, my email address is there. Please do add me on LinkedIn. But if you have any questions after tonight, feel free to drop me an email, and I'm always happy to address any questions. I'm a little
Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Craig. Okay, so now for the Q&A session, please feel free to open your mic and your video if you have any question that you want to ask. Or if you're shy, it's okay. You can type in your question or comment in the two chats below. Okay, so just as we were waiting for that, I just want to give some reminder that after this, we have some photo session. So perhaps you can get yourself prepared to turn on your video.
such a shy group. So just out of curiosity, and you can use the raise hand function for this, how many of you are in a situation where your research has got to change somewhat because of social movement restrictions, traveling restrictions, or simply standard operating procedure restrictions that may impact on how you would normally do things or how your respondents would interact with you normally. Just put the raised hand if that's something. Okay, thanks, Darlena. Right?
Thanks,
Okay,
Darlene.
okay, Amira as well. Okay, so I think the bulk of what I tried to talk about tonight, and probably should have just been my whole speech anyway, is everything, or the most important things that we have to be able to think through. Some of these things we have to address in written context as well, because as we talk about our methodology, as we talk about how we've analyzed our data, and ultimately as we talk about how we've actually come to the conclusions we've reached, these are going to have impacts. It's not your responsibility to fix the problem that is associated with the need to have changed. Future researchers can springboard from what you've done in a more normal face-to-face setting, and they can take it more extensively. Your responsibility is to complete your research today as best as you possibly can so that you graduate. It's not about perfection, it is about completion. And that's why I say our job is, look, let's think very carefully what the issues are. Let's address those issues. Let's do our research given these constraints. And let's just graduate because that's what's most important. And still no questions. Ah!
I have a question.
Oh, right. Awesome. Please.
Hi, Dr. Craig. Thank you very much for that. I think I needed that reminder about it's just about getting the work, getting the research done anyway, regardless of what's been happening for the past 1 year. So my work, I'm doing research with older adult patients at a cardiac center in KL. And because of the COVID, I find that many of my patients, they delay their follow-up appointments, and that just messes up my follow-up data. But I think this is, yeah. So just moving, just planning ahead, just thinking ahead. I find that it's quite challenging to try to get older adults to, answer the questionnaires online.
Yeah.
Or to communicate with me via WhatsApp or emails and things like that. So I just wanted to ask maybe if you have any ideas or, suggestions of, how do we, engage with older adults and getting them to participate in research on older adults using technology.
So there's a couple of things, and I'm going to give not really an example. I'm just going to contextualize this a little bit in terms of the other industry that I'm involved with, in terms of the marketing and branding, because one of the very interesting trends that has come through because of the pandemic is the older generation have adopted smartphone technology at a much faster rate than previously. They might not have adopted it well, and I think that's the challenge you've got, and I'll address that in a second. But they have adopted it to a point that it is now a communication channel for businesses to go through to the older cohorts and the older generations. So even though we see the limitations that are there, and they are genuinely there. You're not wrong with that at all. But there has been a fundamental technological adaptation from the older generation towards smartphone technology. Now herein is where the challenge comes from. How did that transformation happen? It was because the number of older people who were left unsupported during the first lockdown, if I look at the Malaysian context specifically, they had to actually simply move on with respect to it. But they had family support. And this is where I'm going to suggest my answer to you. In order to get that interaction with people, you're still really trying to get someone um, to understand and to be comfortable with using the technology. And it's it's intuitive technology for us because we've had it for a long time, or we've grown up amongst it, the digital generation. The older people that you might be researching are not so intuitive with it. So that's where one of the opportunities becomes to engage, getting their family members or their support teams to help them with coming into the technology, because it has already happened for other things, for check-in at shops, for example, the app, and being able to scan a QR code. The processes are already in the minds, but they still need that support that is along the way. The second thing that I'm going to suggest is you really have to work back, not what's convenient for you, but what's convenient for them. And I discovered this, when I tried to get recordings with Willie from New Zealand, the older professor that I was talking about. Um, you think the trouble I had with my screen tonight was major? You should see some of the things I've gone through with him. And in the end, I said to him, you know what? What are you comfortable with? He's like, oh, I use Skype all the time. Fine. And my response to that was, you're comfortable with that means I will get somebody to help me figure out how to use it for my purposes. And maybe you have to think backwards about what is their comfort zone, and then finding the solution based around that. It's going to be a challenge, but I really want to emphasize the fact that COVID has really increased technology adaptation from older generations. So I don't think that the chasm that was there is quite as big at the moment, but it still is support. It's still about making sure that they know how to use things, that they're comfortable with it. And that's an investment of time. That does add to it in a way. So I hope in some respects that answers your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. I think one of the things I had to do was with the questionnaire, instead of going online, I actually mailed it to them, and get them to create back to me. And it takes more time, like you said. It's just
it
more
does.
effort.
Let me give you just another really, an odd observation, but I know a couple of older people with eyesight difficulties are reading anything on the phone and then having to expand and contract, and it's like, oh, too hard. And that's enough for somebody to say, look, I can't do it, and that becomes the challenge for you. But what I also suggest is, in the 2 resources that will be sent out, have a look, especially the Google document that's in there. There will be some really interesting stuff on this that will give you more, food for thought, if anything, on that.
All right, that'd be great. Thank you so much, Dr. Craig.
Yeah. And that's our only question for tonight. Okay, goodbye. Are there any other questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Okay, so perhaps if there's no more other question, maybe we already sent you a few emails, and from there maybe you can send and submit your question from there, and we try to help you. Okay, is that okay? That's great.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. People are welcome to email me anytime. Just don't expect I can reply instantly.
And don't call you.
Very good. Someone is listening.
Okay, so thank you so much to Dr. Gray and to all of our participants in tonight's webinar. I know as a postgraduate and researcher, we have learned so much tonight. Where tonight's webinar is all about providing our you some of the issues associated in pivoting offline to online, and just so that we can continue our research. So for those who are joining tonight who are not yet like our Facebook or Instagram, please follow ACT4Health. And the third degree, I encourage you to do so now, because we will continue to addressing all of these issues, especially the next one is in qualitative method. So as we promised, special for you that joining us tonight, by Tuesday you will receive an e-certificate and voucher for you to join our qualitative research webinar series on 24th to 26th April. Okay, so because in this series, you will get the 6 CPD point for it. If you join, we will explore and discuss issues in qualitative research that are important for new researchers to be aware of and to navigate. We build an understanding of the qualitative research process by looking at research design principle, the role of and positioning of the researcher, ethical consideration, and ultimately the trustworthiness of data by making sense of our data, and finish with an exploration of mixed method design. And also by Tuesday, you will receive a survey asking for feedback on this event. Your insight will help to shape future events such as this. And also we will send you a link, like Dr. Craig mentioned, to the extra reading material and the recording of this event so that you can share it to your social network. On behalf of ACT4Health and the third degree, thank you for joining us. So good night, everyone. Good night, Dr. Craig. Thank you so much.
Take care.